Boa tarde. Em primeiro lugar, eu queria agradecer a todos vocês pela presença. Nós vamos ter hoje essa palestra de um tema bastante atual, a expansão do fascismo, no caso o fascismo clerical no entreguerras, como isso se dava por uma rede internacional. Quem vai falar com a gente sobre isso hoje é a Nina Valbousquet, que fez a graduação, o mestrado, o doutorado na Escola de Ciências Políticas em Paris. Ela foi também, nesse período, pesquisadora visitante nas universidades de Columbia e Yale, nos Estados Unidos. Atualmente ela vive nos Estados Unidos. Ela é pesquisadora visitante do Museu do Holocausto em Washington e, em breve, vai ser professora visitante da Universidade Jesuíta de Fordham, em Nova York. A palestra vai ser em inglês, mas ela vai falar mais ou menos pausado. E depois nós teremos os comentários aqui do professor Marcos Napolitano, professor titular aqui do Departamento de História, coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em História Social, e que também tem pesquisa relacionadas ao tema. E o debate, as perguntas e respostas vão ter tradução. Então, para quem está com muito medo do inglês, não precisa, tá bom? Teve o show do Pink Floyd, foi em inglês, aí todo mundo se virou bem com isso. Tá bom? Então, vamos começar.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. And I'm sorry I cannot speak in Portuguese, but I hope the PowerPoint will help also to understand. So to start right away, I would like to start with a visual example, which is the first Brazilian version of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So the text of the protocols is a notorious anti-Semitic forgery, which pretended to be a report of a series of meetings held in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, at the time of the first Zionist Congress. So in which supposedly Jewish leaders would have set a plan to subvert the entire Christian civilization through the means of socialism and liberalism. So the document obviously was a fake, and it was forged in Russia around 1905 to blame Jews for revolutionary movements in Russia. But it's only after the Bolshevik Revolution and the First World War that the document, the protocol, started to circulate outside of Russia and in different translations. So this first Brazilian version, you see here, dated from 1936 and was edited by Gustavo Barroso. So this Brazilian version was largely inspired by two French versions of the protocols from 1920 that was published by two French right-wing Catholics. So Roger Lambelin was a monarchist activist, and Monseigneur Join, on which I will focus more, was a Parisian priest. Both were supporters of the Action Française, which was a monarchist, anti-democratic political movement led by Charles Maurras. So this example of transatlantic circulation between France and Brazil leads me to introduce a few considerations on this topic and on the scholarship about clerical fascism and transnational anti-Semitism. So first, right-wing and fascist internationalism is way less studied than left and communist internationalism. And that for two reasons. Obviously, some ideological contradictions between fascism, nationalism, and internationalism. And second reason, because right-wing international tended to be less organized than left-wing internationals. They were more secretive, they work behind the scene, so which raise a problem of sources and archives, so how as historian we can access to these kind of right-wing networks. And it's usually through personal papers, letters, doing a little bit of micro-history and looking at the actors. Second consideration is that among the few studies that look at right-wing and fascist internationalism, the religious dimension, the Catholic dimension of fascism, remain neglected, like understudied. So, for instance, in his classic studies of the protocols, the historian Norman Cohn talked about an anti-Semitic international in the 1930s, but he focused entirely on Nazi Germany and completely overlooked the role played by Christianity in the diffusion of anti-Semitic propaganda. So I instead argue that Catholic networks were crucial vectors of transnational anti-Semitism, especially in the first diffusion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1920. So indeed, two of the first translators of the protocols in French and Italian belong to the same group of Integralist Catholics. And so they were Monseigneur Ernest Join in France, in Paris, who I already mentioned before, and Monseigneur Umberto Benini in Rome. So in this presentation, I will follow this specific group of Integralist Catholics and how this network was then transformed into a network of clerical fascism. So the historian John Pollard defined clerical fascism as being a broad spectrum of clerics and lay Catholics who became fellow travelers or flankers of fascism, that I mean activists who bridge Catholic culture and fascist politics. And then the third quick consideration in this introduction is about the complexity of clerical fascism and why we need more studies about that. Complexity and because of the contradictions of clerical fascism, which was at the same time modern and anti-modern, was political and religious, and it was national and transnational. And so that's why I will focus on the question of anti-Semitism as a key feature of clerical fascism that makes more visible this tension between nationalism, transnationalism, religion and politics, modernism and anti-modernism. So here I need to explain very quickly the characteristics of the trend of Integralist Catholics that I'm looking at. So Integralist Catholicism is the most traditionalist movement within the Catholic Church, the most reactionary. It opposed modernity in all its dimensions. It rejected individualism, materialism, secularism, and liberalism. So they embrace anti-modernism in every sense of the term, not only the opposition to secular modern movements that were stigmatized by Pope Pius IX in his syllabus in 1864, but also the repression of Christian modernism within the church, so any form of reformism within the church, which modernism within the church that was condemned by Pius X in 1907, this encyclical Pascendi. So the trend of Integralist Catholicism originated during the French Revolution with the opposition to the French Revolution, and then developed throughout the 19th century and drew upon the political theology of Neo-Thomism, which considered very quickly that the church was superior to the state, that was above politics, and though integralists advocate not only for a complete restoration of the Pope temporal power, but also for a right of the church to intervene into public affairs. So therefore, integralist Catholics had a very ambivalent relation with politics, with modern politics. They claimed to be independent, they claimed to be above politics, because they consider that right and left were all modernized movements, they were all secularized, so they strongly rejected that. But that's the theory. In practice, because they were counter-revolutionary and anti-liberal, they tend to ally with right-wing movements such as the Action Française, which I mentioned before, and of course Italian fascism. So given their opposition to modernity, Integralist Catholics were also very anti-Semitic. Because liberal revolutions granted Jews civil rights and fostered Jewish emancipations, the figure of the Jews quickly crystallized the Catholic opposition to modernity, the Catholic resentment toward modernity. In sum, they identify Jews with modernity. And their anti-Semitism relied on a form of paradox, which is that they use anti-Semitism against modernity, but they also use modern forms of anti-Semitism. So not only Christian, theological, anti-Judaism, but also modern forms of anti-Semitism, such as social, political, and even racial anti-Semitism. And so that's the argument of the Italian church historian Giovanni Micoli, who mentioned what he called a fluctuating interconnection, nesso fluctuante, between the tradition of Christian anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. And so the milieu of clerical fascism during the interwar period are a very specific, a keen example of this kind of interconnections. So in this presentation, I would like to stress three different aspects of the topic. First, the politicization of integralist Catholicism after the First World War. Second point, the internationalization of the network. And then third point, the institutionalization of clerical fascism and anti-Semitism in the 1930s, and especially in 1938, when fascist Italy adopted anti-Semitic policies officially. So first, the Bolshevik Revolution and the aftermath of the First World War were a turning point for Catholic politics, a moment of renewal of this counter-revolutionary tradition in France and Italy. So the trajectory of Monsignor Benini, that you can see here on the left, is emblematic of such mutation. He was an Italian priest and journalist, then became a well-known professor of ecclesiastic history at different Vatican universities. He was important under the pontificate of Pius X, and he was the leader of Integralist Catholics within the Vatican. After the war, however, he fell in disgrace and was disappointed by the democratization of Catholic politics, and he became more political and more right-wing. So then he founded this new network in 1920 called Intesa Romana di Difesa Sociale, Roman Intent of Social Defense. And he even became an informer, a fascist informer for Mussolini regime, and notably for the political police, Polizia Politica. So integralist Catholics interpreted the Bolshevik Revolution, the First World War, as a sign of providence, I mean, as God punishment against modern society for their rejection of God. And so they had a very apocalyptic and pessimistic vision of the post-war era, a pessimism that was also shared by fascism at that time. So they considered that the post-war era was a cosmic struggle between the church and the anti-church, and that the restoration of Christianity and Christendom in Europe was the only solution to the post-war crisis. That was what Monsignor Benini said in 1923, and bear with me, I will just quote the end of the quotation, where he said that the major practical duty of the good Catholics is to brandish the cross in the face of the de-Christianized, Masonic, and Judaized world. So in this perspective, all means were good to re-Catholicize, to make Catholic again, European societies and politics, including the violence of fascism. So integralist Catholics use a sort of military terminology. They considered themselves as new crusader. They were called by the providence to become, quote, soldiers against the enemies of God. And they interpreted the dramatic changes following 1917, 1918 through a conspirationist and anti-Semitic lens that rely on the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, Judeo-Communism, and the idea of a world Jewish plot. So conspiracy theories, and especially the protocols of the Elders of Zion, provided them with a very easy key of interpretation of all these dramatic changes happening after the war. So Monsignor Juin and Benigni were very convinced about the reality of this Jewish plot against Christianity, and they produced an important amount of documents and material that could prove this conspiracy. So for instance, this 1921 map that was showing the supposedly ramifications of the so-called Jewish Bank from Milan. And so because of their also theological education and the ecclesiastic status, Monsignor Juin and Benigni considered themselves as historians and scholars. And so they turned the exchange of this anti-Semitic propaganda in a sort of expertise, a sort of skill. So for instance, Monsignor Juin wrote to Benigni in 1920, in such an interesting report that you sent me, you wrote several times that there exists plenty of incontestable documents which prove the Jewish campaign for the universal domination of the world. Would you mind indicating me some of these documents and materials from which I can draw the evidence so necessary to my work? So this is from the Vatican archives, from the Benigni papers. I also kept the quotations in their original language, so it's maybe easier than English. So as I mentioned in my introduction, Benigni and Juin were the first translators of the protocols in France and Italy. First, Monsignor Juin, so that's his edition, he translated them from German. So from the Russian version, they were translated in German, and then from German to French. Monsignor Juin, what at that time was the priest of the parish of Saint-Augustin in Paris, which is one of the most wealthy and very conservative parishes in Paris. And he published the protocols in 5 different volumes, and also in his journal that was called the Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes. So it's important to notice that Monsignor Juin's version of the protocols became the most widely disseminated version in the Spanish-speaking world. The first Spanish version was published in Spain in 1927, and then again during the Spanish Civil War. But there were also versions that circulated in Colombia, in Argentina. So this one is the version from Argentina in 1931. And I think the success of this diffusion of Monsignor Juin's version could be explained because of his ecclesiastical status. He had a good reputation within the church because he was fighting for the rights of the church, notably in France, notably in the question of schools and education, Catholic education. He was also recognized by the popes, and he received different titles, such as he was made prelate of His Holiness in 1918, and then became protonotary apostolic in 1924, and he even strategically used this Vatican support in, that doesn't work actually, in his publication of the protocols. You didn't see him, but he published one of the letters of support that he received from the Vatican in this version of the protocols. So following Juin, Monsignor Benigni, translated the protocols from the French into Italian at the beginning of 1921, and this translation was published in Fede Ragione, where a Catholic monthly edited in the Diocese of Fiesole, which is close to Florence in Tuscany. A Catholic publication which received the support of the local bishop, but also of Cardinal Tommaso Poggiani, who was a leading figure of the Integralist group and was notably a consultor of the Holy Office within the Vatican. So it's through this first diffusion of the protocols that clerics, Catholics like Juin and Benigni, came in contact with right-wing nationalist activists that paved then the way to the formation of this anti-Semitic international during the 1920s, which bring me to the second point about this internationalization of anti-Semitism and clerical fascism. So, as the Vatican began to support democratic Catholic politics, Integralist Catholics instead became more involved into anti-democratic reactionary movements and politics, and they were looking for alliances outside of the church with right-wing, secular, nationalistic movements. And this politicization happened not only at a national level, but also at a transnational level. So Benini created this, I mentioned this first network, this new network, the Intesa Romana di Difesa Sociale, and this network was active between different countries: Switzerland, Great Britain, Romania, Hungary, Ireland, Spain, Germany, Austria, Egypt, Canada, and the United States. And to mention only of the few collaborators of this network, they were all active in the diffusion of the protocols, quite small. In Germany, they were in contact with the first German translator of the protocols, Ludwig Müller, in Berlin. In Austria, they were active with Georges de Potter, which is important because he became, after Hitler came to power in Germany, he founded the World Service, the Weltdienst, in Erfurt in 1933, which was a Nazi news agency that played a key role in the diffusion of anti-Semitism outside of Nazi Germany. And in England, there were close to right-wing, they were active also with right-wing political movements called the Britons, and led by Henry Beamish. So the Britons advocate for a new expulsion of Jews from England and a deportation to Madagascar. Their anti-Semitism mixed a rhetoric of Christian defense with a specific British imperialist and racist perspective. So for instance, Beamish wrote to Monseigneur Join in 1923, I realize only too well that the whole of our civilization is built up on Christianity, and that if the cross is trailed in the mud, that all the right races will come down with it. And he also added that right-wing movements should have the courage to name their common enemy, the Jew. I'm sorry, that's the same quotation again. I am now definitely naming the alien instead of using such childish words as international financier of cosmopolitan alien. The fact is, of course, that people tremble at using the word Jew, but I intend to try and instill into the public sufficient courage to name the enemy. So this is interesting because this kind of populist rhetoric that claims to speak the truth of the people, the language of people, is a long-term characteristic of fascism. And finally, the network was... I don't think so. Yeah, this one before. Anyway, they were in... yeah, that's this one, but it doesn't... Well, it's fine. So they were also in close contact with transatlantic networks of white Russian émigrés. So white Russian émigrés were the opponents of the Bolshevik revolutions from different political... yeah, it doesn't want to show this one. It's fine. So they were active with right Russians, activists in the UK, in the United States, in Italy, and notably with one Russian called Tadej de Vilchinsky, who was the official representative in London of the Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, who was the pretender to the throne for the Romanov house, and who came into contact with Henry Ford. So Henry Ford, the famous car industrialist from Detroit, was at that time very involved in an anti-Semitic mass campaign, and he published a global bestseller called The International Jew. I was supposed to explain all of these changes happening after the post-war period. So white Russian emigre Monsignor Join and Benini contacted Henry Ford to seek for his collaboration. And they explained that the right-wing anti-Semitic international was crucial because precisely the enemy, the Jew, was global. So they wrote to him in 1921, only by creating one common anti-Jewish front, we can count on a real success. Acting alone, each by himself, we risk to be defeated by the united and well-organized enemy. We must not forget that one of the chief tasks and aims of the Jews is to cause dissension among the Christian community. So it's sort of ironic that in order to fight what they consider internationalism, they precisely created an international. So between 1923 and 1926, this network organized different international anti-Semitic conferences in Rome, in Paris, in Salzburg, in Budapest. And they had a political program that was founded on what they called the three fundamental principles of Christian historic civilization: religion, motherland, and family. Religion, la patrie, la famille. And they were fighting what they consider being the common enemy of these values, the Jews. So this program was broad enough to attract all these right-wing activists who were quite different between each other. Clearly, they were divergent on many aspects. There were Integralists, French and Italian Catholics, Protestant, white supremacists in England and in the US, Russian Orthodox monarchists, and then neo-pagan and pan-German Nazi activists. So obviously these groups were very clearly different between them, but anti-Semitism provided them the common vocabulary and the common cause that they could fight for. And that's what Benini said explicitly in a letter to a French right-wing activist, Jean Drault, very famous anti-Semitic publisher at the time. He said that on the anti-Semitic field, we can get along and agree with the others. Sur le terrain antisémite, on peut s'entendre avec des tiers. So clearly, anti-Semitism was a sort of expertise that bring all these different groups together. And it's quite explicit in what Monsignor Join wrote about the General Erich Ludendorff, who was a pro-Nazi, pan-Germanist, Volkisch activist. And so he wrote about him, he said, Ludendorff is an imperialist, a dangerous enemy for our country, France. Nevertheless, his feelings towards France do not reduce to nothing his competence about Israel. He had perfectly shown where the common enemy of Europe and civilization was. That is actually the only point on which we can agree. So obviously this kind of difference brought different tensions, different dysfunctions, and that explained clearly the limitations of right-wing and international, also more generally, actually. But however, despite this different divergence, the first attempts of international fascist anti-Semitic international in the 1920s then had a legacy in the 1930s. Most of these actors were still active in the 1930s, Georges de Potter or Henry Beamish, and they continued the project of International. At the same time, clerical fascism found institutional voice, for instance, in Italy, and that brings me to my last point, about the legacy of transnational clerical fascism during the 1930s. And it's important to say right away that in fascist Italy, the merging between fascism, the convergence between fascism and Catholicism was not inevitable, was not predictable, because it relied more on strategical and opportunistic reasons than on ideological reasons. In fact, Integralist Catholics were initially very skeptical and even sometimes opposed Italian fascism, because Italian fascism, Mussolini party, was born as an anti-clerical, anti-establishment movement, as a kind of revolutionary movement initially, and had a strong nationalistic claim on the Roman question. So the Roman question is the status of Rome after 1870, when the Pope lost his temporal power. So, and also Integralist Catholics look with suspicion the fascist political religion and his kind of totalitarian claims. But then the fascist party turned to be more conservative and Mussolini tried to seduce the military, the industrial, and the clerical elites of the country. And so the support of the church for the new regime focused mainly on these reactionary features of fascism, which are the repression of social movements, the conservative, agrarian, and demographic politics, the idea of the Christian family, corporatism, and of course, the reintegration of Catholicism into Italian public life, and especially into Italian education. So, for instance, in 1923, a decree said that it was obligatory to place a crucifix in every classroom, in every public school in Italy, which was not the case before. So as the regime turned out to be clearly a dictatorship in 1925, Integralist Catholics participated in the first political formation of clerical fascism, which was called, the Centro Nazionale, the National Center. So it was a Catholic movement advocating for this collaboration between Catholicism and fascism. And the Benini journal that I mentioned before, Fede Ragion, was actually quite active in this movement, and especially the owner of the journal, Fede Ragion, the Count Filippo Sassoli de Bianchi, which you can see here on the speaking, was quite an important lay figure of Italian Catholicism. So and that's him, and that's the editor of the journal, Fede Ragion. So the signature of the Lateran Agreements in February 1929, between here you can see Mussolini and the Vatican Secretary of State, Gaspari. So the Lateran Agreements was clearly a turning point that fostered the church support for Italian fascism, because it recognized the official status of the Vatican as a state, and it proclaimed Catholicism as the unique state religion in Italy. And so it's interesting to see how the rhetoric of Integralist Catholic changed after 1929, and they start to praise Mussolini for being this providential man. And here, this kind of rhetoric is kind of interesting to see also its legacy. So they wrote about Mussolini in 1929 that he was the new man, called and elevated by our Lord for the salvation of Italy at the darkest time probably of its history. Mussolini, who knew which evil forces were oppressing our motherland, immediately called her back to its tradition. And Italy, shaken by the voice of the man who called her, did raise and obey. There's also a gender dimension clearly in this quotation. So the Integralist Catholics perceive Mussolini and fascism as an instrument that could crush the common enemies of both fascism and the Catholic Church, socialists, liberals, Christian Democrats, Protestants, but also Jews. And clerical fascism play indeed a key role in the diffusion of anti-Semitic propaganda in fascist Italy. Something important to notice is that they were advocating for a Catholic Latin version of anti-Semitism that could be different from Nazi Germany, because Nazi anti-Semitism was considered as anti-Catholic. So they claimed that they were advocating for the specific Christian Latin version of anti-Semitism that was supposed to be more human, more civilized. So when we talk about clerical fascism and anti-Semitism in fascist Italy, we should actually distinguish two different phenomena. One is Catholics who willingly contribute to fascist anti-Semitic propaganda. And one other aspect of it is the fascist instrumentalization of Christian anti-Judaism. And here you can see an example in La difesa della razza, were the official fascist, racist, anti-Semitic magazine. And they drew on like blood libel, as you can see, on like theological arguments, such as the one of Thomas Aquinas. And another example of this is Roberto Farinacci, who was a fascist leader, was actually anti-clerical, anti-Catholic. But he said that, he argued that the anti-Jewish laws in fascist Italy were completely modeled after the church provisions against Jews during the Middle Age and the modern period. So he said that as Catholic fascists, we consider the Jewish question a strictly political problem and not a religious issue. But to comfort our souls, we have to say that if as Catholics we became anti-Semites, we owe it to the teaching provided by the church for 20 centuries. So they were clearly a form of instrumentalization of the church on record of anti-Semitism in order to prove that fascist Italy was in line, was in the tradition, in the continuity of church anti-Semitism. So there are many examples of this kind of propaganda, but I would like to sort of close on one example that shows the legacy of the Benini-Juin network that I presented before and the transnational dimension of anti-Semitism and clerical fascism. And this example is Herman de Vries de Kellingen, who is a Dutch member of the Dominican Third Order, so the lay section of the Dominican. He was a professor at the University of Nijmegen, and he became, at the end of the 1920s, a very internationally recognized fascist propagandist in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. He was a supporter of Italian fascism. He published in 1927 a book that was praising fascism, and the book was translated in different languages, in English, in French. And he also founded in Switzerland, in Lausanne at that time, an international center for the study of fascism. And the center received the financial support of Mussolini. So he was traveling frequently between Switzerland, France, and Italy. And he became, in Paris, he became a close collaborator of Monseigneur Juin, a journal that I mentioned before, Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes. And he published in French different anti-Semitic books that had actually a lot of success. And these different books were translated in many different languages, including Italian, English, Polish, German, Swedish, Spanish. I don't know of any Portuguese versions, but that would be something interesting to look at. And these books received the support, good reviews from church publications, such as La Civiltà Cattolica, which is the Jesuit journal of the Vatican, but also from La Difesa della Razza, which I mentioned before as being this fascist, racist magazine. Here you can see an article from November 1939 who praised him as one of the great international thinkers of racism and anti-Semitism. Here you can see an image when he looked like a professor. He has this image of this respectable, he's like this very bourgeois type of propagandist, very like expert and scholar of anti-Semitism. So because he has this position of intermediary between fascism and the church, fascist officials consider that he was actually helpful to use his propaganda. So the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs believed that his book Juifs et Catholiques, Jews and Catholics, could be useful for fascist propaganda. As they say in a report to Mussolini, the very interesting thesis defended by the author, with a rich documentation, shows that the church, even though claiming to oppose persecutions, has always felt the need to keep the Jews in a subordinated position and far from power. This is the policy that all nations should adopt to curb the Semitic problem. This book, interesting for the documentation, for the bibliography, is an efficient element for the anti-Semitic propaganda and for racist studies. And in fact, Herman de Vries de Kellingen then was commissioned to publish a small booklet in 1940, L'Antisemitismo Italiano, that was actually propagated abroad. So the goal of this publication was to show outside of Italy to show that the anti-Semitic laws were legitimate, and they were legitimate because they were based on church tradition. So the book was distributed in England, in France, in Japan, in Switzerland, and Germany. And it argued for a strict separation between Jews and Christians, saying that the directive principles of the church since the 5th century have been renewed in the recent fascist laws. The church has always forbidden marriages between Jews and Catholics. The Italian law forbids marriages between Jews and Italians. So in this way, there are no legitimacy, for instance, for the Pope to blame Mussolini for the anti-Semitic laws. And I'm going to close on that. This kind of, actually, that's a new edition of this book. And this new edition in English of this book by Herman de Vries-Kellingen was released in 2004 in London by a right-wing publisher called The Final Conflict. And so this kind of rhetoric persisted during the war in fascist Italy. For instance, in Guido Aureli, who was actually a friend of Benini and who was one of the last representatives of this generation of integralist Catholics. And he published in June 1941, so in the context of World War II, he published this anti-Semitic and anti-British pamphlet called Bombardiamo San Pietro. So the graphic cover of the book represented 3 bombs dropped on St. Peter Square, and each bomb with one word. First is Anglicanism, Judaism, and Freemasonries. And so according to Aureli, these were the 3 forces that were fighting against Catholic and fascist Rome. And he said that he wrote the book actually as part of the Christian war that Mussolini and Hitler were fighting against world Jewry. So as he put, the book was written in the ardor and the palpitations of the very Christian war that we are fighting against Judaism. So in 1941. So that brings me to my conclusion, which is that looking closely at this kind of propaganda shows that there was clearly a trend of Christian fascist anti-Semitism that often tried to show that it was different from Nazi anti-Semitism, and it was in a way more legitimate. And this trend of propaganda remained completely unchallenged and unaddressed by the Catholic Church, as well as in public memory. So there is a kind of amnesia about this kind of propaganda. And that may explain why it continued to circulate after World War II and after the Holocaust. So to come back to my very first example about the circulation of Monseigneur Join versions of the protocols, he was reprinted again in Latin America during the Cold War. So in Mexico in the 50s, in Chile also in the 50s, in Argentina in the 70s. And the last version that I found was actually printed in Colombia. And that's the version that you can see now, that is from 2004. So showing again the long-term legacy of this kind of propaganda, but also the transnational circulation of this type of propaganda. Thank you very much.
Alô, agora sim. Eu queria agradecer a Nina. Depois, para quem quiser, ela vai estar vendendo os livros aqui fora. É brincadeira. Agora a gente vai ter aqui os comentários da discussão com o professor Marcos Napolitano.
Oh, voilà. Je voudrais remercier votre conférence et je veux faire mon commentaire en portugais et d'après je vais poser quelques questions en anglais avec l'aide de Daniel et quelques 4 questions. D'abord, je vais faire quelques commentaires en português pour le public. Okay. Bom, antes de colocar as questões para a professora Nina, eu queria só chamar a atenção para alguns aspectos historiográficos do texto, né, que ela apresentou, da conferência que ela apresentou. Primeiro, um dado de originalidade na pesquisa, que é pensar como ela mesma já anunciou na conferência, as redes internacionais da extrema-direita, particularmente da extrema-direita fascista, né? Durante o período clássico, aí, vamos dizer, do fascismo, entre os anos 20 e 40. Né? Esse é um aspecto importante, porque, normalmente, nas ciências humanas, nós estudamos o internacionalismo da esquerda. Então, acho que é um ponto importante enfim, da reflexão historiográfica. Né? Até porque, normalmente, o fascismo é pensado como um tipo de ideologia xenófoba e nacionalista. E, efetivamente, o é. Mas isso não impede de ter redes internacionais bastante sofisticadas. Né? E aqui, neste caso, do tema apresentado na conferência, contou com o apoio da maior multinacional de todos os tempos, que é a Igreja Católica. Né? Uma multinacional que está muito bem aí há 2000 anos. Né? E, é claro, muito dividida internamente, né? E nem sempre o que os católicos, sejam os clérigos, seja o laicato, falam, né, em nome, supostamente, do catolicismo, é chancelado pela instituição Igreja Católica. É preciso que a gente tenha esse cuidado. Né? E o texto também da Nina mostra isto. Né? Que muitas vezes a fala de alguns clérigos nem sempre foi chancelada pela alta política da Igreja ou mesmo pela política específica do Vaticano, pensado aí como um Estado. Né? Esse é um ponto. Segundo, acho que um outro ponto importante é o papel do imaginário, né, na construção do antissemitismo. Né? Os protocolos do sábio do Sião, talvez aí a fake news mais eficaz, né, e longa de toda a história, né, contemporânea. Né? E nós estamos em um tempo de fake news, aliás, fazendo muitos estragos na nossa eleição brasileira deste momento. Né? Portanto, é muito importante que a gente pense a dimensão propriamente imaginária, né? A dimensão inclusive, que torna a discussão verdadeiro ou falso um tanto quanto inútil, né? No certo sentido. Posto que é uma fábrica de imaginários, né, que alimenta preconceitos para os quais muitas pessoas, milhões de pessoas, estão dispostas a aceitar. Né? Então, quem estuda o conceito de imaginário sabe que o imaginário só é eficaz quando ele encontra um meio social disposto a incorporar, enfim, seus elementos. Né? E todo o material que a conferência da professora Nina nos apresenta vive muito dessa produção de um imaginário, baseado numa produção de falsidades efetivas, né? Tendo em vista a ideia do grande complô judaico-capitalista, bolchevique, maçom. Né? Por aí vocês já imaginam que é muita gente para colocar numa mesma sala. Né? Então, esse é um ponto importante do texto. Quer dizer, o papel do imaginário chancelado, neste caso, por intelectuais. Acho que esse é um ponto importante. Todos esses nomes citados aqui na conferência são intelectuais. Aí, é claro que eu estou trabalhando com um conceito muito amplo de intelectuais, mas são, portanto, pessoas que pertencem a uma elite letrada, católica, da Igreja Católica ou da universidade, né, que produzem, né, textos calcados em falsidades, em preconceitos, em mentiras. Que tem, mas de todo modo se apresentam com uma pretensão de legitimidade intelectual. Acho que esse é um ponto importante também, né? Esse é um pouco diferente, talvez, do contexto atual, né? Embora daqui a alguns anos eu já não sei o que vai acontecer, mas, pelo menos no contexto atual, esse é um dado interessante, porque as fake news geralmente carecem de legitimidade intelectual. E aqui não. Aqui nós estamos num momento em que, efetivamente, né, uma certa elite intelectual, repito, eu estou usando um conceito de maneira muito ampla, né, produz esses materiais. Então, esse é um ponto muito importante da pesquisa, que eu gostaria de destacar também. Quer dizer, o fato de intelectuais, adeptos do fascismo, no caso aqui o fascismo clerical, produzirem, né, reflexão, né, supostamente, enfim, ancorada ou na doutrina ou na ciência, dentro do que se entendia por ciência, aí, obviamente, nos anos 30 do século XX, né, a ciência da raça, né, na verdade, para disseminar um preconceito, para reforçar e disseminar um preconceito que era milenar, né, no caso aí, especificamente, o antissemitismo. Veja, então, é interessante porque o antissemitismo é um preconceito que é anterior à cientificização do preconceito racial que vem no final do século XIX. Que aí vai ter como alvo não apenas, né, a questão judaica, como se dizia, mas também todos os chamados povos atrasados, povos bárbaros, né, do mundo, né? Mas é interessante que o antissemitismo já era um preconceito ancorado, né, em várias tradições, religiosas ou não, desde aí, a Idade Média, pelo menos, né? Pelo menos, para não falar antes. Né? E que passa por um processo de legitimação científica e intelectual no final do século XIX. Essa talvez seja a grande questão. A grande novidade, né, que vai, inclusive, depois transformar este preconceito milenário em uma política de Estado genocida, no caso especificamente da Alemanha. Falando um pouquinho do caso brasileiro, eu, quando li o texto da professora Nina, eu lembrei muito do fascismo aqui no Brasil, na mesma época, né? Havia um movimento forte, né, que se chamava exatamente integralismo, né? Embora o conceito aqui de integralismo do texto seja diferente do que no Brasil chamou-se integralismo, né? Embora o nosso integralismo, nossa ação integralista brasileira, né, ela, em princípio, incorporava elementos do catolicismo tradicional. Mas esse era apenas um dos elementos que formavam o integralismo, né? Plínio Salgado, por exemplo, adorava distribuir bíblias autografadas por ele mesmo, né, nos seus encontros, né, com seus correligionários, né? Então é interessante isso, né? Os biógrafos do Plínio Salgado, inclusive, apontam um dado, né, interessante, que é o fato do Plínio Salgado nunca efetivamente ter abandonado completamente nem o liberalismo elitista e oligárquico brasileiro, né, nem o catolicismo tradicional, o que prejudicou, sem dúvida, a sua liderança como um fascista. Estou pensando aqui no Fábio Bertonha, por exemplo, né, na sua biografia do Fábio Bertonha sobre Plínio Salgado, em que ele aponta, né, o quanto o elemento católico era importante neste movimento. Por outro lado, vale lembrar que a Igreja Católica no Brasil, que tem um papel político muito importante desde a ascensão de Dom Sebastião Leme, em 1916, no arcebispado, enfim, brasileiro, ela nunca endossou completamente o fascismo, pelo menos o fascismo enquanto movimento específico da extrema-direita, né? Embora muitos católicos tenham aderido ao integralismo, sobretudo ao integralismo, né? A Igreja Católica no Brasil tinha um projeto próprio, um projeto que pode ser classificado dentro dos chamados corporativismos, que, aliás, é uma questão que eu vou colocar para a Nina, porque o texto dela no fundo, tangencia um debate que é histórico, né, para quem estuda o fascismo, que é o conceito de fascismo genérico. Né? Ela apresenta aqui um conceito específico, é o fascismo clerical, mas é inevitável que a gente pense num debate, que a gente retome um debate, né, que vem lá dos anos 90, 80, pelo menos, que é o conceito de fascismo genérico, que, enfim, tem passado por uma revisão muito forte. Né? Muitos autores preferem usar o termo corporativismos e não fascismo. Fascismo seria uma espécie de corporativismo. Né? Então, de todo modo, é interessante que a Igreja Católica no Brasil tinha um projeto político que não pode ser, talvez, considerado fascista, embora fosse corporativista, fosse, enfim, respondesse a algum tipo de integrismo católico. Né? Por exemplo, é interessante que a Igreja organizou um grande movimento de intelectuais laicos, né, em torno das suas doutrinas para defender, por exemplo, muito mais a partir de uma agenda negativa e não propriamente uma doutrina positiva, certos princípios de organização do Estado e da sociedade, principalmente em torno ao longo dos anos 30, né, quando Getúlio Vargas esteve no poder no Brasil. Aliás, é interessante porque o Getúlio Vargas, que muitos autores consideram proto-fascista, na verdade, sofreu uma grande desconfiança por parte da Igreja Católica, porque ele era visto como agnóstico. Né? Então é interessante que também... E vejam, o Getúlio Vargas era um defensor do corporativismo como modelo de organização social, mas passava muito longe, por exemplo, do fascismo clerical ou das bases da Igreja Católica. A Igreja Católica, inclusive, tinha uma preocupação muito grande com Vargas e seus principais assessores, porque viam em Vargas, ou mesmo em grande parte do exército brasileiro, que era um fiador político importante do projeto autoritário dos anos 30, muito mais uma tradição positivista, portanto moderna, do que propriamente tradicionalista e católica. Né? Lutero, exatamente, vai começar por aí. Mas, obviamente, Vargas era um pragmático e se aproximou da Igreja Católica. Né? E, inclusive, durante o seu primeiro ano do seu governo, não foi ele que propôs a construção, mas no primeiro ano do seu governo, inaugurou-se a famosa estátua do Cristo Redentor, no Rio de Janeiro. Né? Que é uma estátua que hoje virou muito mais uma atração turística, mas que tem um objetivo de consolidar no imaginário popular a ideia do Brasil atavicamente católico. Né? Cristão, mas sobretudo católico. Perdão. Então, esse é um dado interessante que eu queria chamar a atenção. Né? As relações tensas entre fascistas, vamos dizer assim, os integralistas, Igreja Católica e o Estado corporativo brasileiro, corporativista brasileiro, inaugurado por Getúlio Vargas, comandado por Getúlio Vargas, né, sobretudo a partir de 1937, né, quando se explicita a ditadura varguista. Mas o projeto autoritário é bem anterior a 1937. Né. Dentro do integralismo no Brasil, Gustavo Barroso era efetivamente aquele que defendia o lugar central do antissemitismo. Isso é interessante. Né? Gustavo Barroso talvez seja o intelectual. Aliás, um intelectual muito reconhecido, né? Inclusive que sobreviveu a todos os regimes políticos que vocês possam imaginar. Né? Ele foi diretor, por exemplo, do Museu Histórico Nacional dos anos 20 aos quase os anos 60, né? E nunca renegou o seu viés, enfim, ultraconservador e fascista. Ele, dentro do integralismo, Gustavo Barroso era aquele que defendia que o antissemitismo deveria ser o elemento central de uma política, né, integralista. Plínio Salgado não tanto, Miguel Reale não tanto, para a gente ficar nos três grandes intelectuais do integralismo. Então é interessante também como entre esses intelectuais havia também, vamos dizer assim, ponderações acerca do antissemitismo. Né? Quer dizer, por outro lado, né, um elemento muito interessante para a gente pensar, sobretudo em relação ao antissemitismo no Brasil, como aponta o livro da professora Maria Luísa Tucci Carneiro, né, é que o antissemitismo se tornou uma política oficial do Estado brasileiro nos anos 30. Né? Por exemplo, havia uma série de dificuldades para que judeus tivessem carreira militar na alta oficialidade do Exército brasileiro. Né? Por exemplo, havia uma grande dificuldade para a entrada de emigrados judeus nos anos 30 e 40. Aliás, Vargas, nesse sentido, ele era muito hábil, né? E procurava trazer grandes intelectuais judeus, né, perseguidos pelo nazismo, ao mesmo tempo que fechava as portas para a imigração de massa daqueles que fugiam das perseguições. Né? Lembrando o caso do Stefan Zweig, né, que viveu no Brasil, foi recebido pelo centro do poder, né, mas Vargas, o tempo todo, enfim, mantinha numa posição de suspense em relação a uma grande política de apoio aquelas pessoas, vamos dizer assim, entre aspas, comuns que fugiam do nazismo. Né? O biógrafo de Stefan Zweig, Alberto Dines, inclusive, suspeita que o suicídio de Stefan Zweig no Brasil teria sido uma espécie de protesto, né? Exatamente por conta desse não lugar, né, de uma política de acolhida para os judeus que fugiam, né? E ele se sentindo privilegiado aqui por estar abrigado, quase que um convidado oficial do governo brasileiro, vamos dizer assim, teria enfim, cometido suicídio junto com sua esposa como uma forma de protesto, né? Deixando várias cartas, várias pistas de que realmente ele se suicidava porque a sua principal tarefa, que era abrir as portas para uma imigração de massa, sobretudo no Brasil, que era visto como um país supostamente aberto, né, aos estrangeiros, né, um país tolerante em termos de religião, né, ele não tinha conseguido efetivar essa política. Né. Então é interessante que, a despeito da ausência de um discurso antissemita muito estruturado, no discurso oficial, na era Vargas, havia um forte antissemitismo como política de Estado. Então, acho que o trabalho... eu estou fazendo alguns comentários sobre o contexto brasileiro, porque, embora não esteja aqui no texto da professora Nina, a gente pode tecer vários diálogos com o fascismo e a extrema-direita no Brasil, e, sobretudo, em relação à questão do antissemitismo. Feito isso, eu queria fazer algumas questões aí, tentar fazer no meu inglês macarrônico, e aí, se não der, você me ajuda aqui. Não sei se a Nina está compreendendo alguma coisa. Je vous comprends quelque chose? I would like to put five questions. First, it's a conceptual problem, I think, or question, not problem, but question. The role of anti-Semitism in the transformation of the fascism in a kind of political religion. I think the concept discussed by the article of Didier Musidlac, okay, publié dans le XXe siècle. I think you don't use this concept, but in your text have some suggestions of a kind of link of fascism and religion. And why you don't use this, or don't excuse this problem, the fascism as political religion? Is the first question, the methodological or theoretical question, I think. The second question, how we think the anti-Semitism as a kind of culture, popular culture, or diffused culture among the society, and anti-Semitism as politic of state. there's a relation, a mechanical relation between the anti-Semitism as culture phenomena, and political of state. We think, obviously, in an extreme kind of political state, or the genocide. Okay? Because I think in your text, this kind of anti-Semitism is not automatically linked or imply an genocide politic. I think it's more to maintain the Jews are as a subaltern people, subaltern group. Okay. The third question is how we think the concept in your text, clerical fascism, inside the great discussion about the generic fascism. I think the text, I think from the text of Rienzo De Felice, or Emilio Gentili, or other authors, that looking for a macro concept of fascism. Okay. Clerical fascism is a sub-concept of generic fascism, or a specific concept of fascism. Okay. How do you think this problem of the generic fascism? Okay. And the fourth question is a question about memory, about a kind of memory operation, or memory operation that I forgot the word. Obliterate, thank you. That obliterated the anti-Semitism and genocide and Holocaust to the Catholic tradition. Because I think in the public memory, the genocide, the Holocaust, is linked much more to the Aryanism, to the eugenic principles, or even in xenophobia. Okay? Because I think this contribution of Catholic tradition has obliterated from public memory. I think after World War, the Catholics know. Okay? And your text is very important because you remember this long-term tradition of anti-Semitism, a Catholic anti-Semitism. Okay? I think it's all. And I like it too much. Thank you so much for your conference.
Acho que a gente pode deixar a Nina responder essas perguntas e depois pegar as perguntas da plateia, e aí eu vou traduzindo para quem precisar, tá bom? Okay? So, maybe you can answer those and then get those from the floor.
So thank you so much for your question. I hope that will make sense because I hear Portuguese, I write in French, and now I have to answer in English. But that's very transnational, right? And maybe I'm going to mix different questions together. So the question of fascism as a political religion is very important, and that kind of connected to the idea of generic fascism. So the Italian historian Emilio Gentile speaks about fascism as being this political religion. And that's very complex, actually, to integrate in my research, because precisely this idea of fascism as being a new political religion was a source of tension between the regime of Mussolini and the Catholic Church. And so, as I try to show a little bit also, so there was clearly a sort of competition between the fascist regime and the Catholic Church to who's going to have the cultural hegemony in fascist Italy. So, so that was creating a source of tension. And the movements of clerical fascism were clearly not looking at fascism as a form of political religion. So they are clearly, so basically it's interesting to look at clerical fascism as being more like a sub-concept of fascism, but also as a trend within fascism, that trend that tried to push fascism to go in a certain way. That was a very counter-revolutionary way, very right-wing, very traditionalist. While at the same time, within fascism, there were forces that were more revolutionary in the sense that society, they considered that society needed to change completely. They wanted to create a new man. So there is a contradiction within Italian fascism and also other form of fascism, actually, between this, like what I say, modern and anti-modern. So there was one trend that is pushing toward this idea of a new man, and that is very inclined toward modernity, using also sciences and racism as a form of sciences to build this new man. And on the other hand, this more traditionalist trend that is more Catholic. So the question of political religion is also related to fascism as a form of, as a totalitarian regime. And so there is debate, a lot of debate in the scholarship about that, but Emilio Gentile thinks that Italian fascism was the first totalitarian regime and had these totalitarian claims that the Pope, even the Pope at that time, Pius XI, actually addressed that. In 1931, he published an encyclical that was criticizing the fact that the fascist regime was interfering too much into Catholic organizations. And so there was this tension between Catholic organizations, especially for the youth, so and for children and then teenager Catholic organizations. And in his encyclical, Non abbiamo bisogno, 1931, he said that the real totalitarian power is the church. So there was clearly this idea of competition between the church and the fascist regime for this idea of cultural hegemony. And considering now more like the second aspect of anti-Semitism as popular culture. Ah, ok.
Oi. Então, nessa primeira questão, se o fascismo é uma... como é que ela pensa o debate, o tema dela, né, que é o fascismo clerical dentro da discussão, o fascismo como religião política, que é um conceito que surge no debate dos especialistas sobre fascismo, aí, principalmente aí Emilio Gentile, né? A Nina aponta que, na verdade, é muito complicado associar o fascismo à religião, porque, no caso especificamente do fascismo italiano, havia uma forte tensão com a Igreja. Embora houvesse pontos de colaboração, de conexão, havia, na verdade, uma forte tensão com a Igreja Católica, né? Que sempre teve, obviamente, uma preponderância na política italiana, né? Então, esse conceito deve ser visto com muito cuidado, porque as evidências apontam muito mais para uma tensão, para uma certa competição a despeito dessa partilha do antissemitismo. O fascismo ele tem um viés que é revolucionário, no sentido de querer criar uma nova sociedade, um novo homem, e exatamente o contrário, portanto, do integrismo, ou integralismo, que eu vou usar a palavra original, mas aqui a gente chamaria de integrismo no Brasil, católico, que é exatamente a velha sociedade e é contra-revolucionário fundamentalmente, né? Ok? Acho que é mais ou menos esse o resumo, só para...
And so then for the question of the relation between anti-Semitism as culture and politics, and related also to anti-Semitism that led to genocide. So in my research, I have a kind of broad definition of anti-Semitism, so I don't consider that anti-Semitism can be reduced to something that is that leads to genocide, that is necessarily about the extermination. Anti-Semitism is about the hate of Jews, and so it takes actually different forms. And so in fascist Italy, it's complicated because until 1943, until Nazi Germany invaded fascist Italy in 1943, there was no idea of genocide, but there was a strong anti-Semitic persecution that had an impact on the life of the Jewish community in Italy, not only the Italian Jewish community, but especially, for instance, German Jewish refugees who were in fascist Italy, who thought that they were protected in fascist Italy until 1938, when they had to, because of the anti-Semitic laws, they had to leave immediately the country. So there was persecution and there was discrimination. There was no plan of extermination until 1943. So that's a specificity of fascist Italy. But then, of course, this persecution put Jews in a situation of complete being not as citizens anymore, that obviously then facilitate their deportation. And Italian fascists after 1943 participated in the deportation of Jews. But there was not, the ideology of fascist anti-Semitism in fascist Italy was not necessarily aimed at extermination, but at a form of subordination. So that's why here they clearly could meet with the church, because and that's what the propaganda was saying, is that we don't do what they do in Nazi Germany. We are much more Catholic and Latin and blah, blah, blah. And so we just want to put them outside of Christian society. We would clearly want this separation. And actually so some Catholic publication at that time from the Vatican, La Civiltà Cattolica, which I mentioned, Jesuit publication, was arguing for what they call la segregazione amichevole, so a friendly segregation. It's a friendly segregation between Jews and Catholics. So that's what they were arguing for. And so here there was clearly a common ground between fascism and the Catholic Church. And that brings me to actually I'm going to answer the question about the memory at the same time, because it's actually connected. Because there was this idea that this form of anti-Semitism was not as strong as Nazi anti-Semitism and was not necessarily racial, which I actually disagree with, but because of that, the memory of this phenomenon is much more complicated. And it's related also to, so for instance, Hannah Arendt, when she published about the origins of totalitarianism and anti-Semitism, she considered anti-Semitism as only a modern racial secular phenomenon. She doesn't look at fascist Italy at all. And so the historiography on fascist Italy and anti-Semitism was very conditioned by this modèle arendtien, like Hannah Arendt influence actually on that. And so within the church, there was, of course, a complete amnesia about this phenomenon. And I think it's actually important, because I think this trend of clerical fascism and Catholic anti-Semitism before the war explained the first Catholic interpretations of the Holocaust after the war. And that's very important. So, for instance, in 45 until the 50s, the interpretation, the Catholic Church interpretation of the Holocaust, is that it's somehow related to theological arguments about Jews being a people curse because of the deicide. I don't know if you need to maybe translate the deicide, like the idea, the myth that Jews had killed Christ and they were punished by God because of that. So in Catholic theology, there is this idea that Jews will suffer. They're meant, their fate is to suffer because they were the people that was first elected and then rejected by God, and they even killed Christ. So this idea then in some Catholic publications, and not minor but mainstream Catholic publication, in 45, 48, you can find this idea that the Holocaust could be explained by this long history of Jewish sufferings that it explained by the fact that they rejected Christ. So I think here there's much more studies to do about the memory and the very first interpretations of the Holocaust. But just to close on that, there's one important Vatican document in 1998 by John Paul II. We remember, that's the title of the encyclical in English. So it's the encyclical that recognized, I mean, it's not an encyclical, sorry, it's a statement, Vatican statement, that recognized the Shoah, the Holocaust, sorry, and recognized that some Catholics have contributed to anti-Semitism. But the document clearly makes a distinction between Christian anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. And again, they said that modern anti-Semitism was something completely new. So there's a complete dichotomy between both phenomena. And what I wanted actually to do is to show that these two concepts are actually completely, like the lines between both of them are very blurred, and there's a porosity between both phenomena. Sorry, it's very long.
Ela disse que, no caso específico, está mais preocupada com o antissemitismo mais amplo, né? E não necessariamente, não mecanicamente ligado à questão do genocídio, embora, obviamente, há um solo comum nesse tema. No caso específico do fascismo italiano, lembra que até 43, quer dizer, as leis antissemitas começam antes, em 38, né, mas a questão da deportação e, efetivamente, a contribuição para o genocídio se dá, efetivamente, em 1943, com a entrada do exército alemão na Itália, né, já num processo de praticamente guerra civil, né, que vai culminar na derrubada de Mussolini, né, e na República de Saló depois. Então, o que tudo indica que o foco desse antissemitismo específico clerical era muito mais manter as populações judaicas subordinadas, né? E chegando a usar um termo um tanto quanto bizarro, né, eu diria, é um comentário meu, não dela, que é a segregação amigável, né? Enfim, que nós conhecemos bem no Brasil como é, né? Aliás, não obviamente em relação aos judeus, mas, né, em relação, por exemplo, aos afrodescendentes, né? Segregação amigável. E que, aliás, vou fazer aqui um parênteses também, é tradução comentário. Né? Vai lembrar o lugar que a Igreja Católica no Brasil teve em relação à escravidão, que também é outra amnésia importante, né? Em relação à questão da memória, é bem interessante porque depois há um processo de esquecimento desse lugar do catolicismo no antissemitismo, né? Até em função do Holocausto. Acho que a percepção e as narrativas sobre o Holocausto vão mudar bastante. Por um lado, né, vão tornar desconfortáveis essas posições dos católicos, mas, ao mesmo tempo, há toda uma operação no imediato pós-guerra, entre 45 e 48, né, de explicar o sofrimento dos judeus por conta de ser o povo que matou, né, Cristo, ou seja, que rejeitou Cristo, né? O povo inicialmente escolhido, mas que teria rejeitado Cristo. Então, os católicos, algumas publicações, vão explicar o Holocausto ainda em termos teológicos, E, em 1998, né, num discurso, né, do Papa João Paulo II, né, se faz a referência ao antissemitismo, se reconhece a questão da Shoah, se esboça uma espécie de autocrítica, mas nessa perspectiva se separa claramente o que é o antijudaísmo católico do antissemitismo moderno, que seria o responsável pelo genocídio, né? Então, é uma operação de memória bastante sofisticada e que vai, obviamente, atenuar o lugar do antissemitismo católico no Holocausto. Agora acho que a gente podia fazer questões para Roberto. Deixa eu ver meu horário.
Vamos chamar aqui questões do público. Eu vou traduzindo de um lado para o outro. Dúvidas? Perguntas? Diga. Se você for fazer pergunta em inglês, eu vou pedir para você fazer aqui no microfone para gravar ali, porque depois você vai aparecer lá no YouTube. Vai mesmo.
Okay, so I would like to ask about what happened to such members of the Catholic Church, such as the Integralists and the National Center, after the end of World War II and the fall of fascism.
Quem mais? Aqui? No? So I have a question a little bit along those lines. We heard mostly about the cultural circulation of those networks. What about other kind of connections? For instance, some of those Brazilian integralists that were exiled, and I would imagine that they would have received help elsewhere. And in this aftermath of the war, I would imagine that some people might have helped each other as well. So how did it work? Did they have this kind of security networks or something, solidarity, something like that?
So for most of these integralist Catholics, actually most of them die pretty quickly after the war or even before the war. So because they're part of this kind of older generation, they're mostly born around like 1880 or 900. So the Dutch, for instance, propagandists that I showed died in 41. Benini died before. So it's kind of an older generation. The one who did survive didn't have any trouble because in fascist Italy there was not such a, how do you say, épuration, like
Depuração.
Sí, exacto. Like there was in France, for instance, after the war, or in Nazi Germany. So most of the fascist officials and most of the propagandists did actually continue. Guido Aureli still published a book in 46, I think, about the church being Americanized. So now it's like his new focus. And the Catholic Church is too American or something like that. So they didn't have any form of trouble. The trend of integralism then actually found a form of renewal in 1965. So that's the Second Vatican Council, which is very important within the Catholic Church for the modernization of the Catholic Church. And that's the first time that the Catholic Church recognized that there were other religions that could lead to salvation, basically. So it's the first ecumenical moment, acknowledgement of ecumenical within the church, to say it very briefly. The integralists, obviously, they oppose that very strongly. So here there is a new trend of integralism that was born from the opposition to this modernization of the church, and that was specifically also anti-Semitic. So here there's some, but I haven't worked some, I would like to work more on that. And also, should I answer everything? Yeah. And so actually, for the Brazilian integralists who were exiled, I actually don't know, but that would be an interesting question. But of course, these networks were also not only cultural, but were also network of support. So Benini, that I show initially, because he was a fascist informer, he had close connection within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so he helped a lot of white Russians émigrés to get visas to settle in Italy. And in Italy, they were mainly in Rome and in the south of Italy, because Puglia having this kind of Orthodox church, the eastern part of Italy having this Orthodox, Christian Orthodox legacy. So they settled there. And Guido Aureli, so this guy was in contact with them, and this book is also the product of his connections with this white Russian immigrant in Italy. So there was also some sort of, it's a network, it's a network in different dimensions, and one of them is it's also form of sociabilities and form of support like that.
Muito bem, gente. A gente não precisa ficar com vergonha, ser tímido, a gente traduz, pode perguntar em português, não tem problema. Vocês querem que eu traduza aqui rapidamente o que ela disse? Ou todo mundo entendeu? Diga. O que você preferir.
I'd like to ask, because you mentioned how these various transnational fascist groups, and religious clerical fascism, but you mentioned a bit about how there were also Protestant groups. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to ask if you could maybe draw just a few examples or a few ways in which these also Protestant groups, but were also fascist, how they relate in perhaps a bit, just a simple picture in the various places, or a few examples and ideas.
Hi, I'm starting to write a paper about, well, it's basically the same, but in Brazil. I'm researching a newspaper, a Catholic newspaper in the 30s, where a lot of these aspects come up. Mm-hmm. So they talk a lot about how, in relation to Nazi Germany, how Hitler was doing good because he was trying to protect the families. And they also talk about the Jewish problem, mm-hmm. but they see the Arianism as a problem. Mm-hmm. So it's very ambivalent, mm-hmm. and there's also a question about Hitler and the church, mm-hmm. concordate. Mm-hmm. And it's very ambivalent. And I want to know if this could be an influence of all this thought, or if this was a broader view of the church. Mm-hmm. The newspaper is called A Cruz. It's from a paroquia, a paróquia in Rio. Mm-hmm.
Mais alguém? Ali atrás? Quer vir de novo? Vocês atrás não querem perguntar? Não? Não?
I know finding contradictions within the Catholic Church is not the hardest thing to do, but how could the Church use such a concept like Christian war against Judaism made by Germany and Italy if they had clear conflicts with the Italian fascists and went as far as seeing German fascists as anti-church?
Okay.
So these are interesting because they're somehow related also. with like Protestantism and Nazi Germany. So I will start by the Catholic newspaper in Rio. That's actually very interesting. That's not so surprising in terms of like the tensions that you mentioned that are kind of the same as I found in fascist Italy and even in France or in different countries. So I would say that it's probably an influence of kind of this traditionalist thought within the church, neo-Thomist influences. So the Integralists are kind of the right-wing part of what we call more broadly the intransigent, Catholicisme intransigeant, for instance, in France. So they are at the right-wing part of this broader force within the church that was basically until the 50s is the mainstream interpretation, because it's related to the relation of the church with modernity, which is basically a rejection until the Second Vatican Council, almost. So I would say it's, so it could be both. It could be part of these broader tendencies and then maybe more specifically something that is also connected to this integralist trends. And the relation with Nazi Germany, so it's actually complex also within Nazi Germany, because within Nazism, there are trends of Nazism that are clearly neo-pagan, anti-church, and anti-Catholic, clearly. Then there are the Protestants who also try to do a kind of nationalist church in Germany. And then the Catholics, some Catholics who did try to find a common ground with Nazi Germany, including in the Vatican. So the Secretary of State in 1933, during the time of the Concordat between Nazi Germany and the Church, was Eugenio Pacelli, who then became the Pope during the Second World War, Pius XII. So Pius XII, during the Holocaust, it's a controversial Pope, obviously, well, I won't enter into too much detail into that, but he's the one who signed the Concordat with Nazi Germany. And why? Because he was very pragmatical and diplomacy was the most important for him. So he was like, okay, Nazi ideology is clearly not compatible with Catholicism, but we have to defend the right of the Catholic Church in Germany. So that's why they signed the Concordat. And then there's a little bit of ideological convergence, which is anti-communism. So they saw Nazi Germany as being this form of defense against communism. And for some of them within the church, that also goes with the idea of Judeo-communism, but not all, of course, the Vatican was like that. But clearly, anti-communism was an official policy of the Catholic Church at this point. That's very clear. And so for Protestants, so I answered a little bit about Nazi Germany, but then what I wanted to show is actually this network was kind of informal and was composed of different groups. So there was the Catholic Integralists, and they did exchange all of this propaganda, and they did meet in conferences with Protestants from Great Britain, from the US, like Henry Ford, from Germany, and also with Christian Orthodox from Russia, obviously. And the Christian Orthodox were the most problematic for them because of the status of the Catholic Church in Russia was very bad before the Bolshevik Revolution. So they were looking with suspicion at right Russian immigrants, saying that you want to bring back the Orthodox Church in Russia. So there were some tensions like that. So what I was trying to show is this tension. In terms of anti-Semitism, the Protestant trend of anti-Semitism tended to be more modern, because there's not the same from the Protestant churches, and that's a very complex world. There's less hostility toward modernity, and there's less hostility toward nationalism also. So to say it it's a very stereotypical division, but within the Catholic Church, anti-Semitism was mainly anti-liberal and anti-modern and very conspirationist. Within Protestant Church, it's more national and it's more secularized in a way. And just to end on the last question, the contradiction, how can they say this is a Christian war, but also Nazi Germany is anti-Catholic? So this is related also to the context, which is different. So 41 is so this is war, this is fascist war propaganda against Great Britain, and showing that Great Britain is like Judaized, Masonized. So there is this aspect that can explain why he can say something so obviously doesn't make any sense. But then there is also, who are we looking at? So this is Guido Aureli, is a layman. He is a Catholic, so and he's a journalist that was specialized in Vatican reports from the 1903 to. So he's very well known in the Vatican, like talking about Vatican issues in the Italian press, and so there is of course a difference between what the Pope says, what the bishops thinks, what the layman thinks. So here, and maybe I should have said also in introduction, obviously the Catholic world is very complex. And what is interesting is actually to look at how this kind of propaganda was interpreted by the highest ranks of what are the different connections between the different levels of the Catholic Church. And that's obviously a very complex question, because then you look at different local context.
But okay, now it is. So I would like to thank very much for all of you who came here, very qualified audience. And I'd like to thank Nina for her presentation, taking in her visit to Brazil to come here and share her knowledge. And agradecer ao Marcos aqui pelo debate, as considerações, o esforço, e muita força aí pra gente.